Hey guys, welcome to Game Junkie episode 2, and I'm here with my buddy Matt. Hey Matt,
Hi.
thanks for coming on the show. Matt is a massive indie game junkie, so I was really excited to have him on and kind of share with you guys some awesome indie titles you can try if you haven't tried them, some indie developers you can look at if you haven't done so, and we want to talk a little bit about the importance of why as gamers, we should be supporting indie developers and kind of what it means for the industry moving forward. So I'll kind of let you kick it off because this is the thing you're passionate about, Matt.
So I was invited on here because we are talking about indies, as she said. It's very important for us to support indies. The reason, obviously, being that every developer starts small. A lot of indies are passion projects versus guaranteed money makers like the big companies like developers to make. Indies are often where the best ideas, the biggest passion, and the best art direction or most unique art direction generally come from. A lot of indie games inspire a lot of huge games, and a lot of indie games sales, partially because they're usually cheaper. A lot of indie game sales really push those big companies to take more risks, simply because games like Celeste and Hades sell huge for a lower cost of development, and as a result are profitable almost immediately. So it's an attractive entry for smaller developers, and it's very attractive to big developers when they see games like Celeste and Hades explode.
Oh, Hades was so huge too.
Yes, I know. I
And
haven't played it yet. Unfortunately, I'm right around the corner from doing so, but I haven't played it yet.
yeah, and it's I'm going to go ahead and say some developer names, and I'm still fans of these developers. For example, Ubisoft.
Hmm.
Once upon a time, they were my favorite development company, and now I just kind of see them put out a lot of broken AAA titles that feel very much like a copy paste. Totally not a discredit to what Ubisoft is capable of doing, and not a discredit to people who love their games and love their franchises. And like you said, and you said a lot of things that really got me thinking. If you look at some of Quantic Dream as an example, back with Indigo Prophecies, that was such a revolutionary game that I
Absolutely.
played on PS2, and I'm like, wow, this is awesome. And then Heavy
Yep.
Rain came, and now they're really no longer an independent developer. They're going to be self-publishing, and they got
Yeah.
so big, and they changed. I look at games like Hidden Agenda and Erica, which I totally love, and they're indie games, but I feel like they got a lot of inspiration from what Quantic Dream did.
Totally.
So that's
Absolutely.
that's super cool. So yeah, just dig into that, man, and give us more of that knowledge.
Yeah. Um, I agree with you about Quantic Dream. I loved Indigo Prophecy, which, just so everyone knows, if you're watching outside of the United States or outside of North America, the game's called Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that game was really, really unique, and there was nothing like it before. And it really did spawn an entire genre, really. To from uh, Indigo Prophecy to Heavy Rain, and I remember Indigo Prophecy was not really marketed. Nobody really ever heard of it. It just kind of appeared on the scene from a developer really nobody was familiar with, is the best way to say it. And it led in, and that's a perfect segue for indie games because they really did go from the underdog trying something completely new and unique and extremely risky, especially because Indigo Prophecy, at least back then, games had to be published. They had to be pressed onto discs. There was a huge cost with game distribution. So indie games, they've always existed, but they weren't really called indie games until the ability to self-publish or release games at a much reduced cost. Games were 50, 40, 50, $60, partially because the cost of simply distributing it and selling it was so high. So games like Indigo Prophecy were huge risks back then, but because they paid off, games like Heavy Rain and Detroit and Beyond Two Souls exist. And then, of course, a huge assortment of games based off or that took the ideas from Indigo Prophecy and Heavy Rain and things like that. Hold on, it's saying that my CPU usage. Just one sec. One sec. Sorry. Get rid of some of this other stuff in the background.
We're not going to edit this out. We're going to leave this in because I feel like this is a very gamer moment where like you're playing online and your internet drops out or you get like FPS drop, right?
Yes,
in a bullet hell game. So we're leaving this in there because I don't like to edit the show, but this is very gamer related. Did you do this on purpose?
I did. I wanted to give people a real full gamer experience.
Yeah. Okay, so I think you were kind of talking about, I think we were talking about Quantic Dream and how those games led to.
Absolutely.
Okay, so go ahead and continue from there.
So yeah, those risks taken by smaller developers have often turned smaller indie developers into full-sized giant studios that produce AAA games as often as they can, of course. But a lot of those studios still like to make smaller games on the side as well, because that's where they started, and that's where a lot of the gaming magic comes from.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just, in my head, right? I'm thinking of Returnal. I mean, we know that Housemarque has made some great games. I mean, people liked Ex Machina.
Resogun, Superstar.
Yeah, people liked those games.
Titles.
But the jump, if you look at the quality jump, I mean, and this is, of course, relevant to technology growing, but the skills of the development team and the animators and even the project managers, the skills of going from what they produced to what we think, right, Returnal's going to look and feel like, and what some of the reviews are saying, that. So you're essentially saying that kind of jump in quality and that jump in gaming, all right, if you look at Naughty Dog and you look at the jump from Uncharted 1 to 2, that's what we get when we support indie developers. And we actually, when we can, we buy indie games at full price. So
totally.
Okay.
And I think because indie games are often cheaper, there's far less of a risk in buying and trying them. Largely, piggybacking off of what we were saying about Housemarque, largely Housemarque has been an indie developer. And to some degree, Returnal is still an indie AAA game. Housemarque has never really broken into that huge, extremely costly development cycle like so many other studios do until Returnal. It's clear that Returnal has certainly gotten a lot of funding support, obviously from Sony. Not that that's a bad thing at all, but it clearly shows that us supporting developers like Housemarque, who has been around, I mean, for a couple decades now. I remember them launching really, really early on PS3 with Super Stardust HD. I played that game for hundreds of hours, and there were 5 worlds. They were all largely the same. I'm not sure if you ever played it, but it's basically, there's a lot of games like a Geometry Wars. They invented Super Stardust back in like 94. But basically you're on a spherical world that's about that big on the screen. And you're a little ship and the world revolves. You are flying around the world, but the world's just kind of turning beneath you. Remember asteroids? Mm-hmm. You're just a triangle. And there are asteroids coming and you break them apart. That's exactly what Super Stardust HD is. It's just a 3-dimensional version of that with extremely pretty graphics and hundreds or thousands of objects on screen at once. That game was so addictive. And I mean, just unbelievably perfectly tuned. It just showed they had such a craft. And that game sold fantastically. It was one of the very early PS3 games, which I'm not sure if you got a PS3 when they first came out, but there was not much going on for it.
Yeah, I had all of them from PS1. That's when I made the jump from Nintendo. And since then, I've gotten them all around the launch date.
Me too. So you're aware, the PS3 was a pretty dry console for that first year or two. And Super Stardust, I know it's not fair to say that it filled the gap on the PS3 because it alone, being an indie title, couldn't do that. But honestly, I got several dozen more hours out of that game than I ever expected to. And because we all, and maybe part of it is because there were so few games, but everyone got that game. That game sold so well that we got games like Nex Machina and Alien Nation and man, what else did they? Resogun. Resogun was a huge launch title for them for PS4. And it's really where they started to flex their capabilities as developers. Did you ever play Resogun?
No, those aren't my types of game. I'm
Totally understandable.
Yeah, I just don't
Resogun is
tend to
kind
enjoy
of like
them.
Super Stardust, except it's on a, instead of being a spherical world, you're on a round, two-dimensional. The best way for me to describe it is it's a side scroller, but
Sure.
the world just kind of turns. So you're
Mhm.
kind of in a finite loop. And enemies just keep coming. It's kind of like Super Stardust. But the world was built with voxels, which are tiny cubes instead of polygons. And so when you would destroy or characters in the world, it would physically break down into tiny chunks. And I'm talking, it felt like millions of these tiny cubes. So they were really starting to flex their capabilities as developers then. And because we supported those games, which were small, I'm sure extremely difficult efforts from these indie developers, we get games like Returnal.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I mean, back in the 80s, these very basic 2D platforming games, which was really the bread and butter of Nintendo, they were such basic games, but the coding effort and the development effort was so huge at the time. So it's
Absolutely.
really neat to see how, increases in budget and in technology allow us
Yep.
to work. You said some interesting thing about budget. Budget doesn't really make the talent. So
Right.
if we look at games like Hellblade, we look at games like Hades, we look at Cuphead, we even look at games like Stardew Valley, right, which
Mhm.
is hugely popular. Those are not big budget titles
Right.
in comparison to like Assassin's Creed Valhalla or
Right.
Cyberpunk or Grand Theft Auto. So just throwing money at a development team does, I hate to knock, I'd hate to take a crap on Cyberpunk here, but that's
It
a
does.
lot of money, right? And if you look at the comparisons, it's just there's so much talent coming from these indie studios, and I think they have to focus really hard on being good, because when you're a AAA title, you're going to sell, and you're going to sell
Absolutely.
across multiple platforms. Indies, and a lot of them become first party, exclusives. They know they have, I can only sell on PC or
Yeah.
on PlayStation. So I've cut what I can sell down. So they really kind of, I feel like they have more pressure regardless of budget to
Definitely.
give you that kind of performance. And I feel like that's how, at least on the, on the PlayStation side, we have teams like Naughty Dog and Insomniac, and like Microsoft now having Ninja Theory as an
Yeah.
example is
Mhm.
because of that. So is there kind of more that you can shed on that, or are there any indie games in particular that you think people should look at or play because they're just a shining example of that kind of just polish and
I think you named a couple of them, and we are kind of focusing on smaller indie games, whereas you brought up a good point. There are indie games that are much larger than something like Ubisoft's Child of Light, which was a great game. If you like turn-based RPGs, definitely pick that up. Ubisoft is a huge developer, and they take occasional risks on smaller games that sometimes pay off. But like you were saying, Ubisoft's name is going to sell that game to some degree regardless. Just like Cyberpunk. Everybody on this planet knows that that game is a dumpster fire. And I love CD Projekt Red. I don't know what happened with Cyberpunk. I'm not even going to try to dive into that. That is not an indie game, and it runs and plays and looks worse than most indie games. So not necessarily looks worse if you let it load for 5 seconds after moving 10 feet. So we can't really, like, that game sold 13.7 million copies because CD Projekt Red's name is on it. So games like throwing money, like you said, throwing money at games does not mean good development. When a company, it feels like, especially the further we go into game development, when a big company is resting on its name, on its popularity, it seems like they are putting less effort, even though I don't want to downplay the effort CD Projekt Red put into making Cyberpunk, because I am not a game developer. I only make games in dreams, and it's really hard. So I will never knock game development or glitches or anything like that. I know how hard it must be to code billions and trillions of lines. No judgment there. But game companies like Quantic Dream, like who made Cuphead? I feel terrible. Their name is slipping. I can't remember who it was.
Wait. MD. I almost said MDMA. That's not it.
That's not it.
It's MDHR.
MDHR, yes.
Yeah.
So those companies, I feel like those smaller companies have to go back and rest far more on their capabilities, and they really have to put their blood, sweat, and tears into that product, because the only thing selling that product is that product.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Whereas
absolutely,
if CD Projekt Red were to release Hades tomorrow, let's say Hades never existed and CD Projekt Red were to release Hades, that game is going to sell millions of copies simply because CD Projekt Red is known. And we know we love The Witcher. And that is why, specifically, even big games like Cyberpunk sold 13 million copies, is because we were like, it's going to be good. They made The Witcher 3. It's definitely going to be fantastic. Whereas a company like Quantic Dream, before Heavy Rain and stuff, they have to really say, every time we show this game, it's got to sell the public, and it has to sell whoever's watching it to go tell 10 of their friends, you have to go buy this game. So it's hard for indie developers, I'm sure, to break into this business, but it pays off huge because the cost of development is so much lower if the game sells well.
Yeah, I mean, gaming is just like any other industry, right? It's Absolutely. A business. Restaurants are a great example of that. If I decide to open up a restaurant, right, a way that I kind of look at indies is if I go out and I start a chain restaurant, I open up a Chili's or a Bonefish Grill. That's not an indie kind of establishment. It's not as big of a risk because they provide the menus, they provide the costing options, they provide some of the management and training. But if I open up my own small mom and pop restaurant, that's the same idea as an indie developer. I have to market myself. I have to produce a quality menu, consistency, and a management team that gets people to come in and eat there and like the experience and tell their friends and keep them coming back. And that's really kind of, I mean, that makes sense, right?
The great thing about indie titles is that because they are less expensive, not necessarily less of a risk, because these companies don't have coffers of money to make these games, but because they're less expensive and they can take more risk with it, there's a lot more freedom. And it just makes, not always, but it just makes for this is where we find more of our unique experiences at this day and age. Simply because, like you said, if I go to Bonefish Grill or McDonald's, I know every single item that's on that menu, and I know exactly how it's going to taste no matter what, which is part of the draw of having McDonald's, right? Is that you can go to any city and be like, you know what? I know exactly what I'm getting if I go to this restaurant, so that's where I'm going to go. Whereas you can take a risk and go to like, some mom and pop hole in the wall restaurant and find the best calzone you've ever had in your life. Or you're eating rubber because it's terrible. And indies are the small businesses. If a product is selling at Walmart, it's going to sell. And it's going to sell every time somebody walks by that. Just being in Walmart for any number of items, they're going to see that item on the shelf. It's at Walmart. Whereas you own a small business, you're expecting word of mouth to save you. As people walk by that store, you have to bring them in, and you don't have to bring people into Walmart. Walmart is self-propelled at this point.
Oh, God, isn't it? And Amazon too, even though I hate them both.
Yes.
You know, it's interesting, and I use McDonald's a lot if I'm teaching marketing classes. Consistency is really important, and
Oh, absolutely.
it's a strange part of human psychology that we will choose consistency that's a poor level
Yep.
rather than an unknown. We know McDonald's food is not it's not very good. I think everybody can agree that it's not quality
We
food.
can
It's
definitely
not
agree.
really good, but it's pretty cheap, and we know what we're going to get: a teeny
Yep.
tiny little bitty bun, barely any beef. People choose that consistency even though it's bad because they
Absolutely.
know it.
Yes.
So that brings up the question again. This is not intended to attack anybody or go after anybody. I buy a lot of AAA titles. I'm not the biggest indie player, so I'm not trying to be self-righteous when I talk about this. But if you want to see more of those risks, more new IPs, you want to see developers get bigger, part of that responsibility lies on us as a consumer. So instead of
Absolutely.
going to the McDonald's, right, we try more of the mom and pop restaurants. So maybe give folks some ideas of some of your favorite indies. What are some indies that people can get into if they want to start looking more into them and supporting those developers more?
Well, recently, I would say games like Hades and Celeste have been on people's mouths a lot. We are kind of in a moment during this generation where a lot of the games coming out are bigger budget simply because the indies don't have the resources or budget to go after like Xbox Series X and PS5 yet. But man, as far as indies go, just off the top of my head, I wish I had my PlayStation in front of me right now because I could go through a list of them. You know that I'm going to say this is a hard one because it's not fair, but Dreams is a AAA game. It is. It got hundreds of millions of dollars from Sony for development from a AAA studio who has released several tried and true games. But Dreams is a gem because within Dreams is nothing but indie titles developed by either a single person or very small teams of people. So definitely, obviously, I'm going to plug Dreams because it's like my favorite thing on earth, and it's full of indie art and indie titles and indie music, and everything is developed by a couple people. But there are so many games that I could suggest. I recently played Foregone, which I would not say that was a huge indie title. It's probably made by a small handful of people. You've probably never even heard of it.
Mm-mm.
Definitely recommend it. It's kind of it's like a side scroller RPG.
Oh.
Sort of like a, what do we call a Metroidvania title, but with guns. So it's a lot of fun, and that's it's like you were saying about McDonald's. You don't take a risk by eating the same burger. You decide one day, I'm gonna try this mom and pop shop either nobody's ever told me about, or hopefully I've heard of from 4 different people saying, oh my God, this is delicious. So I think I'm struggling to come up with specific titles off of the top of my head, only because my brain is so focused on all these games coming up
Well,
that are.
I think that's okay because you mentioned Dreams, and I was hoping you would talk about that. Because all of the content within Dreams is indie based,
Yeah.
I considered that to be an indie title. It's like Sex, Love, and Robots on Netflix. Netflix isn't an indie
Right.
content developer, but
Right.
every single piece of content within it is created by an indie team from
Absolutely.
around the world. That's so it's kind of the catalyst that gives those people their shot. So I think Dreams might be the best example of this, because Dreams essentially is the catalyst that's giving all these people a shot, really.
Absolutely, it is huge. And I think it's important. I was thinking about a couple indie titles. I don't know if you've heard of Wreckfest, but it's basically a
Yes.
spiritual successor. It's free on PlayStation Plus in May. It's basically a spiritual successor to Destruction Derby. And it's developed by a very small team called Bugbear. They've only released a couple titles. Flat Out back on PS2 was the last big game that I remember them making. And then they've literally been in studio releasing videos and I want to say basically tech demos of this engine that they built for vehicle destruction. And that game engine that they kept showing off tech demos of became so popular that they were finally able to publish a game based off of it. And it's a really enjoyable game. It's so over the top and silly. Everyone should definitely try it. That's an indie game. It's got a perhaps it feels like it's got a larger budget, but at the same time, it very much feels like an indie game. You can tell it was made by a smaller team with just fun ideas. There's one race where you're a person sitting on a couch with wheels, and it's just a bunch of couches on the track. And there's probably like 40 cars on the track at once, or 40 couches. And it's just stupid little stuff like that games like Gran Turismo and Forza and stuff would never, ever touch. It's silly stuff like that. And another example, are you familiar with SnowRunner or MudRunner?
No.
So that is basically a huge exploration driving title that is 100% physics-based, and it started as a tech demo. The tech demo was called Spin Tires, PC exclusive, obviously, because it was just a tech demo. And it was made by, I don't even know how many people. It's a very, very small company. But basically, the physics are the star of the show. The water, the mud, the snow, your tires even, all react to each other in an extremely realistic fashion. Ooh. And so they got so much popularity on just these tech demos in these videos that they were able to make an entire game, 2 of them now, Mud Tires and MudRunner and SnowRunner, both of which are really, really enjoyable games. I highly recommend it if you like driving, and it's really just fighting the off-road element in a vehicle is really what the game's essential makeup is. But what I'm saying is that it's important for us to give recognition to those indie titles, because those small tech demos that I was praying would become something got to become something simply because the popularity of watching the videos. So supporting indie developers in any way possible almost guarantees their ideas will become something more. And that's not true of AAA developers. AAA developers say, here's the game I'm releasing, please buy. Whereas indie games, we really do have so much more control and capability over what gets released and what's in these games versus AAA development. Indie is like it's our ability to touch the market.
No, that totally does make sense. I remember when PS4 had kind of released the niche PlayLink games.
Yeah.
And I thought this was cool. I'm going to go buy a couple and support it. I love Hidden Agenda. I think it's a fantastic game. It's better when you play with friends. If you play by yourself, the timer doesn't let you find enough clues, but that was a freaking gem of a game. I really actually enjoy Erica. I like those kind of game style movies. Knowledge is Power. Oh my God. Absolutely. And Frantics.
Yes.
We love to play those games.
Yeah.
So I want to see more of that. So I try to support as many PlayLink titles as possible.
Absolutely.
And this isn't PlayLink. I haven't played it yet, but Disco Elysium was from an indie developer, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. My God, the feedback of that game and the quality of that game is so it's so many little hidden gems that you can find that aren't going to be heavily marketed titles. They're not going to be coming from these really well-known studios. So don't overlook those things when you hear people talking about it. Don't be afraid to take, and if you can't, we all have budgets. If you can't buy games day one, that doesn't mean that you can't support the industry. So maybe, do you have any advice there? There's a lot of people that, we all some people, they're not going to be able to go out and buy, brand new 50, 60, $70 games. So what are some ways that people can support the industry if they do always have to be conscious of a budget?
So I would say, obviously, with the exception of like Nintendo, most games go on sale at some point. My cat's about to jump into frame, just so you know.
That's okay. I love it.
Most games go on sale at some point to allow a broader access. And I think that's really, indie games tend to do it faster, with the exception of some Sony titles like God of War, who I think it was like within 4 months, they were like, come buy this game at $9.99 because it sold 18 million copies. And they're like, let's sell it.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of indie titles tend to hold their price perhaps a bit longer, but they're always on sale. I don't think I've ever seen an indie title that stays full price forever. And almost within the first month or two, you can grab games on a sale. And when a game is $15, a sale reduces it to $6.99. I'm not saying that everybody has $7 to willy-nilly throw away. Most gamers have a little bit of free budget, I think, because video games are not cheap. Honestly, they're very expensive. So I think
that cat is so cute, and he's like looking at the ridiculous conversation.
He knows. So I think it's important for us to support indie developers, but that doesn't mean that we have to support them day one. Just like AAA games. I have day one disease. That's what I call it. I buy everything the first day it comes out because I have FOMO. I have fear of missing out. And I don't want to ruin anything within the game through conversations, because obviously I'm very active on Twitter, and Twitter is very active in the gaming world. So it's important for us to support indie developers, but you got to do that the way that works for you. If that means waiting till it's $7, that's still half the price that they offered that game at. And they've probably, hopefully, made their money back by now if it's on sale.
Yeah, that's I have an Oculus Quest, which is fantastic, a lot of fun. I've got a couple of my friends have it, and we get together and play a little. I mean, the Star Wars games, right? The Vader Immortal. I knew that was going to be a purchase. Beat Saber, of course. There's a lot of titles that
absolutely
I discovered because I said, well, it's on sale.
Yeah.
So I'm going to get it. One of those games is Keep Talking and Don't Explode.
Is it good?
What a fantastic game to play with friends. It's challenging. There's an absolute level of like strategy, puzzle solving. Everything is on a timer, so you're like really feeling it. What a steal of a game on sale. I think we got for $12, $13. Richie's Plank Experience sounds like the dumbest thing ever.
Totally.
But these little things are so fun, and we're constantly finding these really great little VR titles that we wait for sales.
So VR is a really good example of indie title development, and it's a unique one because everybody has a PlayStation 4 or an Xbox One or a Nintendo Switch. So releasing indie games on those is even lower risk than VR, where VR is a very expensive approach. Like, yes, I have a PlayStation 4, but in order for me to play, let's just say Skyrim in VR, even though that is not an indie title, let's go back to Keep Talking and Don't Explode. Isn't that what it's called?
Yes.
That game took a huge risk. Almost every single game in VR right now is an indie title. VR is a great market to look at for indie titles, because not only are these almost all of the games on VR indie, but they're huge risk indie titles. Because, for example, PlayStation VR, I think Sony said sold like 6 million total VR. I don't know the numbers on like Quest and Quest 2 and Vive, but we know for a fact that it's a fraction of the actual video game market. So all those games are almost entirely indie and hugely risky. VR
They
That's a
haven't
huge treasure trove of indie games.
they haven't sold that many. Oculus I'm googling it because I actually
Yeah,
didn't know because I didn't know we were going to talk about it. Oculus Quest 2 only they're just shy of 2 million units.
yeah.
That's not
I know that when Sony released and this was a couple years back, but when Sony released the first wave of information about VR, they were the front runner in the game, and the sales were still pretty unremarkable. I think at that time it was like 2 or 3 million sold PlayStation VRs. And so if you think about those games, big developers feel like VR games are a huge risk because let's say everyone on Earth that owns an Oculus Quest 2 buys the next big game that comes out on it, that's still only 2 million sales. So most people approaching VR development are indie developers, simply because big publishers are not really backing that yet. There
I
are
sure hope
games.
they do.
Yeah,
I
me
hope
too.
it's fun. I think it looks like total they're up to about 4 to 5 million.
Good.
It looks like between the 1 and 2. And
Well,
it's hit or miss. There's been
totally.
games that I've refunded because I'm like, this just doesn't the the hardware is very different. So sometimes
Yeah.
the quality of the game experience, but for anybody who's on the fence about getting a Quest, they do give you up to so many hours of gameplay and you can refund a title.
Oh, good.
In my opinion, you cannot lose with that system. That is
That's true.
we don't normally get that benefit in gaming. I know that the hardware is a little pricey, but I have the original. The 2 is the same price and it's a lot more. I think it's a great investment, and
Absolutely.
you have that you have that. She wants that now.
Kitty show.
Yeah. So you do have that that guarantee that they will refund that.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of really, really amazing games on VR. Like I said, most of them are indie games like Super Hot and
Oh,
Beat Saber.
so good. Both of
Honestly, I can
those.
Walking Dead, Saints and Sinners,
Arizona
Operation
Sunshine. Arizona
Arizona
Sunshine.
Sunshine, yes.
Oh,
Brookhaven Experiment, man. I don't know if you've played Brookhaven Experiment, but you're
mhm.
literally just standing in one spot with a gun. I think you can get 2 guns or like a rifle, and monsters just work their way toward you from any direction. It's one of the most addictive games I've ever played in my life, and it's such a simple idea I want to say the game was $20, and there's no way that if that company went up to Sony or Microsoft or Nintendo and said, "Here's my idea," they would have been like, "That's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. You're standing in one place just fighting waves, you can't even move." Works. Totally works. It's a blast. That game is so much fun.
I wonder if it wasn't indie. I want to say Activision made the first Guitar Hero game. That's not an indie game, but it is still an example of how new IP is a lot of risk. There's so much more work that goes
Totally.
into, like CD Projekt Red, all of the work they put into creating this world and creating the characters. That's phenomenal. That's
Yeah,
huge.
absolutely.
So remakes, right, and sequels are really popular because you don't have to come up with as much creativity. So those
Well, and there's no
risks,
risk. There's
there's
no risk there.
it's much lower risk because you can kind of play on what you've done so far, and you don't. And with new IP comes all kinds of legal costs because you have to copyright it, and there's a lot that goes in there. So
Yeah.
I know it's not an indie title, but Guitar Hero for me is a big example of how taking risks can get you. And it inspired Rock Band, and it inspired Rocksmith, which taught you
Yeah.
how to play guitar on the reel. So, are there any big AAA titles that you can look at now that immediately make you think of an indie in which you think that they were inspired from?
Well, I know that this one keeps coming up, but Returnal is a huge example simply because, like I said, Housemarque has been a largely tiny studio. Yes, they have PlayStation's uh, support for most of their games. They are not an exclusive developer. Some of their games are multi-platform. Sony does not own Housemarque, but Sony does appreciate the risks that Housemarque takes, and often supports them as a console developer. And it caused games like Returnal, which Returnal, watching the gameplay in the few trailers that they've released, it very much plays like Super Stardust and Resogun and Nex Machina and their smaller title games like Alienation. You can see their risks. Eco, don't pull your fur out. He pulls his fur out if I don't pay attention to him. You can see all the risks that they took in those smaller titles now play into this giant game, which they've said, this sold so well. People love this in Super Stardust. People love this in Resogun. People love this in this title. So now they're like taking a combination of all that stuff that they made and making a giant, amazing game off of that. There's not a lot of, because usually series starts AAA and stays AAA. I can't think of many titles that broke away from that indie mentality, and that's because the mentality remains. Even if a game like Hades 2 were to release with huge development backing it, we would still say that's an indie game because Hades 1 was an indie game and the same studio's making it. So I don't think games really ever break away from that indie word.
Hold on. Wait, your internet cut out there a bit. Look at this. What a gaming issue. This is also
what a gaming issue.
What a gaming issue, you guys. You got to see two technical issues here with Matt today that this isn't getting cut out either because we don't do that, but this is such a gaming thing. Like we just experienced, like if we were playing online right now, which I rarely ever do, this is the cardinal sin.
Exactly.
Okay. Trying to think of exactly. Oh, we were talking about the indie mentality that tends to stay for a long time with indie developers.
Yeah. And I think we see a lot of game, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Child of Light. I think I talked about it a little bit earlier. It's a turn-based RPG, but it's an Ubisoft title developed through they had a little program going earlier in PS4 life. And I don't know if it's still a thing, but they were releasing a lot of indie titles, and they were trying to push indie a lot because the development is cheaper. There's less risk for the developer, and the payoff is huge if the payoff is huge.
Sure.
When a game only costs a couple $1 million to make and sells 5 million copies, the return is much larger than a game that costs $100 million, which usually makes their money back right away. But it's an attractive thing for big developers, and I see a lot more developers these days taking these huge risks. Ubisoft was doing it a lot, late PS3, early PS4 gen.
I know.
They released amazing games like From Dust that just were so unique and changed so many things about video games, but never got the footing to get a sequel or have their ideas be popular enough to broaden into other games. But I think that it's important for companies like Ubisoft and Sony and Microsoft and just really any of the big companies, Nintendo, to support those smaller developers and take those small risks, because that allows them to feel more functionally comfortable taking risks in AAA development, which I was really worried about. There was an article quite a few years ago, an interview with Sony, and they were saying 6 out of 10 PlayStation exclusive titles make money for us, and another 4 out of 10 will never make any money. And that's the way we always want it, because it allows us to take risks and try new ideas and release games like Dreams, and Little Big Planet was a huge risk. I remember people being like, that game is not going to sell. It's a build your own platformer game. And before long, it had sold like 10 million copies.
And look at Sackboy. Sackboy
is huge.
Oh my God, what a fantastic game.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
so much fun.
Yep.
So I see what you're saying is you can't, all of the titles that we love and enjoy now that are AAA level had to get to that point. These
Yeah.
teams have to get to that point. The influence has to get to that point.
Absolutely.
So I think as it's probably about time we wrap it up because we have been talking a while. But
Yes.
I think that's kind of really the thought process here that Matt is so eloquently articulating, and I'm grateful for that, is that we need to support those risks. And sometimes we need to take risks as gamers.
Absolutely.
You know, I didn't get into the God of War franchise until way after a lot of people and said, wow, this is on sale.
Yeah.
It might be a good game, and said, holy shit, I'm going to buy all of these at launch because I want to support it.
Absolutely.
So, you know, if you're eyeballing the same game more than once, think about getting it on sale and, you know, take a risk.
And this is where things like Game Pass really do. And I know a lot of people have a lot of negative things to say about Game Pass, and I hear all of that. I hear the negativity, I hear the positivity. But there's a point out there that's repeatedly brought up about Game Pass, and that's that I would not have tried this game if it wasn't on Game Pass. Because I'm already paying into this service, and a new game releases, a smaller game, that I would have been like, I don't want to spend $10 on some, you know, what looks like a simple shooter or simple RPG mechanics. But because it's on Game Pass, I'm going to try it. And then as a result of trying it, maybe I go buy it because I love it and I want to support the developer. Or I go tell my friends all about it. And once it falls off Game Pass, that means sales.
Yeah.
So I think things like Game Pass, to a much less extent, PlayStation Now, are hugely beneficial to indie developers. Where
I agree.
The risk, or PlayStation Plus is another good example. These huge companies like Sony and Microsoft say, essentially, we're going to give you a ton of money equivalent to, let's say, 1 million sales, which guarantees all your money back and more or less guarantees a sequel for you. And you're going to let us give this game away for free on Game Pass or PlayStation Plus to promote it further. Games like this is.
Oh, he's doing it again. He's doing it again. Wait for it. Nope.
Oh, can you hear me?
There it is. Yeah, there
Okay.
it is.
Destruction All Stars is an example of a game that Sony said, this game is not going to sell for $70. There's not enough content in it. It's made by a smaller developer. Let's pay for the development of this game and then give it to everybody for free to try to give it some footing. I do see a lot more of that happening with big companies like Sony and Microsoft, and I think that's hugely important. And indies are the lifeblood. They're the small business, right? We always say small business is the backbone of America. They are the small business of the gaming industry. They are the backbone of the gaming industry. We see a lot of the risks taken with, like, Minecraft was an indie developed game by like one dude. That Mahjong dude made Minecraft, which Microsoft later bought for $2.4 billion. Now we see hundreds, if not thousands, of games trying to use that same procedurally generated idea, voxel technology, to sell what Minecraft sold so successfully. So these indie games really are the lifeblood. A lot of what we see in AAA games comes from these tiny little games.
I think that's, great. I'm going to close it out with just a recap here. Game how you want to game. Support the industry. There's no wrong way to be a gamer.
Correct.
Game Pass is great. Buying games is great. Whatever platforms or singular platform you want to play on is great. Buy the games that you enjoy, but don't be afraid to take a little risk.
Right.
You know, Twitter is a great place to meet people and kind of develop trust and get opinions of people that are like-minded as you on games. So ideally, you guys just, you know, support the gaming industry as best you can with your positive words and with your wallet. And I think with that, we will go ahead and wrap up a fantastic episode 2. Matt, this was Awesome. So much knowledge coming out of you.
Thank you.
Definitely, if you have any indie games to recommend, please leave them in the comments below. Check out some of the games that we recommended. Support those indie devs. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Again, thanks so much, Matt.
Let me just add real quick.
Yep.
$10 for an indie game. Take that risk, because even if you hate it, it was worth it. $10 is like the price of a really cheap fast food meal that you hate it anyway. So just think of it that way. I would have spent this on McDonald's. Just take a risk, see how you like it, and if you enjoy it, tell everyone you know about it.
That's 100% accurate. All right. Until next time, we'll see you guys soon for episode 3.
All right. See you soon.